Afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Beecroft, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be looking at the value of internal auditing. So there's a wonderful opportunity to look through this webinar today. Amazing. So look at the agenda today. Before we go into the delves in terms of the actual value of internal auditing, I think it's really important to just to really get the fundamentals done first so that we're all on the same level playing field. And this includes looking at an overview of the ISO management systems and Annex Excel. Most of you should be familiar with that already, but for those who aren't, I think it's important to go through that in detail. Then we'll go into understanding what internal auditing is. So we'll really go drill down into detail in terms of how you prepare for them, what you actually do, how to write non-conformity reports and all that such as well. So then once we have that foundation, and we can really go into the detail about understanding the value of both internal auditing and the value of internal auditors, which should be good. And as mentioned before, we'll have a Q&A at the end. I suspect this webinar should take about 30 to 40 minutes to deliver, and then maybe about 20 minutes or so at the end for questions. But I've got a free afternoon after this, so if everyone has any pertinent questions that take a lot of time, I'm more than happy to stay around until the end. Fantastic. So this picture of me, you can't actually see me on the screen, unfortunately, but you have to do with that picture. But just a little bit of information about myself. Otherwise, I'd just be a random person just speaking to you about internal auditing. So I am the training manager for NQA. I've been in the role for about almost a year now, and I'm responsible for delivering all training courses for NQA. In addition to this, I've also done some sort of self-development, and this includes achieving lead auditor status in ISO 9001, ISO 27001, which I recently passed, which I was very happy I did that. And I've also achieved the internal auditor status in both ISO 14001 and 45001. And about 1 million years ago, at this rate, I did a PhD at the University of East Anglia, and I've also taught a significant amount of time at several universities, including UEA and University College London and the London School of Economics. And then in between all that, I also worked for Pearson Education, the big sort of education company, where I worked in delivering postgraduate online distance learning for thousands of students across the 7 UK universities. Perfect. So that's a little bit over of me. And just a brief question from Lauren. Lauren, I'm not sure if you heard it from before from Tracy, but the slides will be available after this webinar and the recording as well. So I think you will all be sent this afterwards, so you'll be able to view that in your own time, at your own pace, whenever you want to. Fantastic. So yeah, so we're now going to dive into a little bit of overview of ISO and the Annex Excel systems. But to start off first, I think it's really important to really go into detail about the process model. Now, the process model is quite a key part of ISO management systems because ultimately we've got a variety of different organizations and businesses that use ISO standards, but it's important to really simplify that into a really nice straightforward formula so that we can use that when we're internal auditing or just simplify the process. And you can see this here, where the process model is defined as any activity which receives inputs and converts into outputs can be considered a process. And this process can be used for most products or services are considered processes. So when you start with input, activity, output, that's essentially drilling down or simplifying any organization's sort of process into this sort of format: input, activity, output. And ultimately, we'll be going through this as you go through the slides of the presentation. And this is a really key element or foundational if you will, formula, if you will, internal auditors use to analyze a process as a whole and understand what is the inputs that go into it, what is the activity that converts the input into an output, which is what goes out. And you can see this from a simple creation of a product. So if the activity is creating some sort of product, the input is the request to make the product, the things you need to actually make the resources you need the product, and activity the means of manufacturing it, calibrating it, the training needed to build out as well, and the output is what you produce to make sure if it fits it conforms to whatever is required as part of those inputs. But to be clear, just to make sure everyone's on the same page: input, activity, output. And likewise as well, I've sort of discussed this. This determines the processes within that management system, whether it's 9001, 1445 as well. And you need to identify what the inputs and expected outputs are. And these then determine what the sequence of interactions are within that activity to ensure that what we put in for that inputs is what you want from that output. And a big part of that is ensuring there are really effective controls, making sure that everything's in place, making sure that you're not getting non-conforming products or outputs, but you're getting conforming outputs. Oh, I've just seen a question here from Lorraine. I can't hear anything but sound. Check is working. Any advice? That's a bit of a strange one. I think everyone else can hear, unless I'm getting that also from everyone else in terms of whether they can't hear. Lorraine, if you might be the only one, it might be best to just come out of the webinar and join again if possible. I'm sorry if it's a turn it off and on again kind of advice, but that's worked in the past for other delegates. But to go back to what I was saying for the process model, you need to make sure as well that you address those risks and opportunities that actually might impact impact the negative way, the risks of making a conforming output, and likewise any opportunities that might actually improve the output in any way, shape, or form. And then finally, in this case, you need to make sure that you're assigning responsibilities and authorities to every part of that process, whether individuals who are responsible for bringing the resources for the input, the manufacturing for that product, for that activity, and perhaps the customer satisfaction or service potentially for that output, and make sure all the products are conforming. That's the process model. This now links in quite nicely to the plan, do, and checked act, the PDCA cycle. Now, you might have seen this before, you may not, but ultimately what this is a nice diagram that showcases how to, using this diagram, how to build out a management system. And you can see how the different elements here and how it fits in. And you start off with the planning element. Like you see the planning starts at the top, and then it goes to do, check, and act. The planning determines the goals for a process and what is needed, or the needed changes to achieve them. The do is implementing such changes. The checking element, that's one on the bottom, evaluates the result, determines performance, and the act standardizes and stabilizes the change, and most importantly, as you can see from the cycle, begins the cycle once again, depending on the results. But you see what happens here is the idea is meant to be a cycle. You start at any different point, at any point in that process, and you get a clear idea of what needs to be done here. And whether you've improved something, you go at the very beginning, planning. But the other elements of the plan, do, check, act cycle all fit in, and they all link into the clauses of the standard. And we'll look at those clauses in the next slide, but you'll see, for example, how they link in, whether it's planning for plan for planning, a support operation for the do, performance evaluation, where internal auditing sits, that check, and improvement, clause 10 for act. And outside as well, that context of the organization is that sort of clause 4, but right in the heart of that is leadership at clause 5, which is really essential to the implementation of any management system, and key when you're an internal auditor, looking in terms of just confirm that commitment from leadership. Perfect as well. I've just actually seen here as well, unfortunately, you're right. I think that actually Caleb has said, I know that in response to Lorraine's advice, Lorraine, if you can't hear me, what I will do actually, I might actually just write a message to you now saying to try turning off on again. Try logging in and out of the webinar to see if that works. Perfect. I'll just send that over to Lorraine. Perfect. But Caleb, thanks for addressing that, because if she can't hear me, then I can't hear her giving the advice. But perfect. So we'll now move on now to the actual next slide, which is the Annex SL high-level structure. This is the sort of structure used by nearly all ISO management systems, and it's broken down in sort of the 10 clauses here, as you can see in detail. The top 3, the scope, normative references, and terms and definitions. Those are the 3 sort of ones that sort of you'll see in quite a lot of different standards. But the real core of the ISO is that sort of clauses 4 to 10, and that links in quite clearly with the plan, do, check, act. And you can see this here, for example, in clauses 9 and 10 of the ISO standard. 9 in particular is where we'll be focusing today, that internal audit at 9.2. And you can see here how the check element fits into that performance evaluation. As you can see here from the previous diagram, a performance evaluation, that check element there as well. And likewise as well, that clause 10, that improvement. 10.2 is particularly relevant when you're raising nonconformities, potentially as part of that internal audit. And also that commitment to continual improvement, 10.3, which is a real essential part, not of internal auditing, but the entire standard as a whole. Perfect. Right, so we're just going to keep going now in terms of looking into the actual more of the basics before we then jump into what internal auditing is. But a really big part of this, internal auditing in general and the standard as a whole, is that any management system has to emphasize the use of processes, including organizational, supporting, and operational. But most importantly, all such processes must be documented. And this allows the management system to be monitored not only by yourselves at the organization, but most importantly, by your internal auditors. It's set out quite clearly in clause 7.5, the requirements needed in that, but it comes up throughout the different standard as well, and all the different types of clauses to make sure whatever process is in place, it is documented and maintained and ensure that it's retained appropriately so that, if asked, an internal audit can review these documents if needed. And you might see different types of documents here as well. This is some examples. You got forms, records, work instructions, defined processes as procedures. You might even have a manual or even a quality environment. This is not a requirement of the standard, but ultimately you might see this quite a few organizations if you may have this or not. But it's important that as an internal auditor, you almost put the internal auditor hat on, and you're just trying to really delve into what kinds of documents are here to show that the actual management system has been implemented sufficiently or not, depending on the quality of that. Perfect. Right. So I see that I think Simon tried to give some advice in terms of trying to help Lorraine with the sound. I'm not sure if Lorraine you can hear us or not, but I did message you to see if you can hear us, and if anyone else is having any issues, we'll take it from there as well. Amazing. Right. So we're going to now delve into the overview of internal auditing in detail. And to be clear, you can hear the definition from ISO 14001, where it states that an audit is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So I hope to give you a little bit of flavor in terms of what audit is, but what we are focusing on today is that first-party audit. Now, it's defined as audits carried out by an organization on their own system. So it's all internal, it's in the name, internal audits as well. And this differs from second-party and third-party audits, where a second-party looks where an audit is carried out by an organization on their suppliers or subcontractors, and a third party is an external audit performed by an independent body, usually for certification purposes. So in this particular case, you might actually see this as well for third party for NQA. NQA might do a certification on yourself and might actually send an external auditor to conduct that process. But today, we'll be focusing on that first party, that internal audit, and go into that in more detail. But the most important thing when we do internal audits is to really set the objectives. What do you want to achieve? What is actually the objective of this entire exercise? And ultimately, it comes down to making sure that whatever is being assessed, audited, is conforming to what is conforming as required. And this is conformance against the standard, whatever the standard is, 9001, 1445, or what it may be, and conformance to their own management system. So it's important to get that clear here. You're obviously trying to make sure you're doing both rather than not just one or the other. You can see as well conformance to contract requirements. Now, these requirements may be, say, an agreement you may have with a subcontractor where they have said that we will only do business with you if you maintain your certification to ISO 14001. So that might be a requirement there. So that can be interlinked potentially with the conformance to the standard. There may also be a conformance to certification body requirements. So if NQA may have specific requirements, they may want to see particular audit reports or your audit program, and that is a conformity there. And then finally as well, conformance to compliance obligations. So this is regulatory, legal, anything relevant to your business, which is appropriate for those things. Perfect. So when you're preparing for the audit, there are multiple different inputs in to make sure that you're all as prepared as possible. Now, we've discussed a couple of these already. We can see compliance obligations, the audit standard, management system, the contract, as mentioned before, that sort of, if you will, those contract requirements. But it's also quite important to discuss three other things here that are particularly relevant. So the results of previous audits and external audits are particularly relevant because it allows the internal auditor to really go into detail and go, right, okay, so with audits done previously, it may raise these issues or these non-conformities, and it's important then to review those and go, okay, have they been resolved? And if they have, then the corrective action process, then perfect. And then you check how many X months or years later, and you confirm, is it still an issue? Are there more concerns? Are there less concerns? Has this been addressed? So it provides a bit of an understanding when you're preparing for the audit to understand what has been reviewed before, what has worked, what hasn't, and that prepares you in terms of where you want to be focused to be. And likewise, there's also for external audits with the exact same questions. And finally, in this case, is the audit scope. Now, the scope of the audit is quite important because ultimately you're defining what to focus on for that audit. In this particular case, you might want to focus on a geographic location. So you might have an organization that has 3 different sites, site 1, site 2, site 3. All sites have ISO 9001, but sites 2 and sites 3 have ISO 14001 and 45001. So in that particular case, the scope of the audit might be saying, I only want to focus on site 1. I don't want to worry about the other sites. That's what I do. So when you prepare for the audit, you're making sure that you have everything you need to audit that one site. But what you don't want to do is go beyond the scope, what is known as scope creep, where you define the scope in conversation with the auditee, and then you go, oh, well, even though it said actually that you don't want to do one site, actually want to look at all 3 sites, because that creates more questions rather than answers. You might have to get more auditors to actually conduct that process. You might need to have more time to actually go through different sites. You might have to arrange more interviews with individuals on all 3 sites as well. But it's important when you're preparing for the internal audit that you're really clear with the scope. You confirm that with the auditee, and you stick to that scope throughout the entirety of the audit. Perfect. So that's how all the things are input into the actual preparation, and through that you actually get the audit. So hopefully this gives a bit of a brief overview in terms of what you'll be doing as an internal auditor through that process. And we'll go through each sections of these in more detail as we go through the presentation. But for every internal audit, you will have an opening meeting and a closing meeting. An opening meeting is a wonderful opportunity to set the stage, make it clear who you are, what you want to achieve, what the plan will be today, what you should be focusing on as well, so that you and the audit team remember exactly what it will be discussing in detail. Oh, I've noticed in the chat, apologies, is that I think that that there might be some issues with audio. I see Nick, you're having issues with audio, and maybe Lorraine. Can I just do a check with everyone here? Can everyone just confirm that they can hear me, or if there are any issues? Just use the chat and just say you can or can't hear me. I've got Terry saying I can hear, which is fantastic. But yep, can still hear, amazing, perfect. Okay, we can hear as well. So, okay, unfortunately, it might just be just a couple of individuals who aren't hearing that as well. If you can't hear, I'm just going to write down into the chat. If you can't hear, please try entering and exiting the webinar. Apologies, everyone. Just making sure that everyone else can actually hear this. The last thing I want to do is make sure is everyone can hear apart from 1-2 individuals, and they don't get the same experience as everyone else. So if you can hear, fantastic. If you can't, just see that in the chat and try exiting and entering the webinar. Perfect. So just continue back. And as you finish that closing meeting, you want to follow that audit plan. And this is the plan you want in place that you make sure you have a clear scope you want to focus on for the day, whether it's the individuals you want to interview, the processes you want to see, the areas you want to observe firsthand. And this is where you ask the questions and record the answers. And that's a key part there, because ultimately what you're doing, you're collecting evidence to ensure that the management system is working as intended. However, though, there may be situations where you need to assess the evidence against the criteria, whether it's the clause, whether it's the management system requirements, well, contract requirements, the regulatory requirements, whatnot. And whatever you do, you must take notes, because these notes will be formed the part of your summary, and in nonconformities if raised as part of that summary as you present that at the closing meeting to the auditees. But when you are collecting that all that evidence, you are making sure that it is objective evidence. And now, objective evidence is defined as data generally consisting of records, statements of fact, or other information supporting the existence or verity of something. Now, this can be obtained through a variety of different methods, whether it's interviewing, whether you're interviewing all different individuals, about whether they're knowledge of a process or whatnot, whether you're reviewing documents and records, whether that's a process, but whatever detail, and observing. And observing is a really key part of the internal auditor, because ultimately what you want to do is that you want to make sure that all these match up. And you want to see, okay, I see this process on paper. I've talked to the individual responsible for the process, but let's actually see it. Let's see it actually taking place. And that 3 sort of forms quite a nice sort of strong way of collecting that objective evidence. Because as an internal auditor, or just an auditing in general, you want to be following that audit trail. Now, an audit trail is essentially where you follow a part of the process from the very beginning to the very end. And you can see the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, how all this sort of links in together of how you'd actually follow that audit trail. And for let's say, for example, say you interviewed the sales manager, that sort of top square rectangle at the top of the diagram, and then they confirm to you that actually when they process sales orders, they don't actually record all the detail they should do when they actually inform the warehousing team. So in that particular case, is okay, we've interviewed this person. Okay, the process may not be working, but we'll make a judgment. I'll have a chat with the warehousing team, and then you confirm the warehousing team obviously processes the order as sufficient. But then what you do then, you actually then just do when you go back to check quality control, and they check the actual requests from the customer against the sales order and what's been produced. Actually, there's a bit of a disconnect there, and that has to be sent back to manufacturing to make the changes as well. But you see what's happened here, where you've actually traced a particular audit trail all the way from sales, warehousing to quality control, and actually you can see, okay, maybe that input activity output isn't working as strongly as it could do, and that might be a concern or potentially even a non-conformity erase as well. So that audit trail, you can see how the example is where you're sort of following that from the very beginning and all the way up to the very end. Perfect. Right, now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you an example of an audit checklist. Now, you'll meet several auditors. They'll probably do their own way. They'll probably do very different to this, but this is a good example, a good starting place to start off with. And you can see on the sort of the headlines or the headings for each of the sections. The question topic refers in the particular case to actually area of focus you want to do as the audit. The ref or reference can be used to write down the clause from the particular ISO management standard, or ultimately even actually referencing your particular manual or process or even the management system from the organization. And then the response is what has actually been what has the auditor done, what steps have they taken, have they interviewed anyone, what was the responses, and then the evidence is the evidence, so demonstrating whether actually it has met the requirements or meets conformity or does not. And you can see example of this here on the left-hand side and on the audit checklist here. So this is using ISO 14001, and you can see that in the references in the terms of different clauses are measured against. But in this particular case, you see overview of waste processing. That top left one is going against ISO 14001 8.1, the operations clause. And if you look actually on the right-hand on the next slide, you can see it in its full view. And if you continue that first line, overview waste processing, ISO 14001 8.1, that clause, the response in this case for reviewing the waste processing is that the auditor, it's Chris Moore in this case, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, it says that he has toured the waste storage areas and discusses with the waste manager. So, okay, so he's actually observed something and he's had an interview with the waste manager. And the evidence from this, as you can see, is that generally good housekeeping, which is a good, and minor littering and oil spills. But if you look closely, then the next line, observe areas for wood and plastic and oils and chemicals, and see photos, some minor spills of oil not cleaned up, and some uncovered skips and plastic. So bit of a concern there, where actually, if you look at that, they looked at the question and topic, the overview of waste processing, the clause there as well, look at the response, maybe a bit of a concern, and we will continue this in more examples as we go through the next couple of slides. Now, as an internal auditor, there might be a situation where you might need to raise a nonconformity. A nonconformity is a non-fulfillment of a requirement as defined in ISO 9000, and ultimately, it means the audit criteria has not been met. And whether this means the system is not complying, whether it's not compliant to their own management system, a specific customer requirement is not being met, or a regulatory requirement is not being met, any of those elements are enough to raise nonconformity. There are three types of things you can be raised in an audit, and two are nonconformities, and one is opportunity for improvement. Now, that opportunity for improvement, or OFI, is, as it says in the tin, an opportunity to refine the system. So what's happened here is the auditor has identified an issue. It may not necessarily be an issue, and you go, right, okay, it's not enough to be considered a nonconformity, but most importantly, it may develop into a nonconformity if left unchecked. And that's the important part here. It's just saying that, well, just raising it could be an issue, not now necessarily, but could be in later. But ultimately, for any OFI, the organization is not required for it to be to act upon it. So unlike nonconformities, which has different requirements, an OFI, it may become a nonconformity, but not yet. But it's just an opportunity for the actual audit to go, right, raise an issue here. I think this is something you can look at as in more detail and to stop you from getting a nonconformity for the next audit or in the future. But now we'll look at the actual types of nonconformities. So we've got a minor nonconformity, and a minor nonconformity is defined as a nonconformity which does not affect the capability of the management system to achieve its intended results. So again, I'll repeat, a nonconformity which does not affect the capability of the manager system to achieve its intended results. So if you go back to that process model, that sort of input, activity, output, clearly is an issue, but it's not impacting the ability to actually produce conforming products. So that's where you obviously have to be like that line there, because ultimately a major nonconformity is one where it does have an impact on the ability of the management system to achieve its intended results. And the specific or precise definitions as used, the first one is it should be classified as a major if there is significant doubt that the effective process control is in place or that products or services will meet the specified requirements. So this is ultimately raising doubt, basically, that the actual input, activity, output is not actually meeting the requirements as needed and is not meeting those outputs as intended. But more importantly, and this is how the major and minor is linking together, a major nonconformity can also be given if there is a number of minor nonconformities associated with the same requirement or issue that demonstrates a systemic failure. Now, as an auditor, I can't tell you that there's a specific number of minor nonconformities that might equal a major, but to give an example, say you are sampling, I know, three examples of a sales process or sales inquiries, and you find an issue with one out of the three. That may be a minor nonconformity, it may be a major, but what you might do if you had some time and you wanted to sample some more, if you sampled another three, so that we, and then so it'd be 6 in total, but actually you found that actually there's only one thing that was an issue and the other 5 were fine, there might be constituted minor nonconformity. We might need more information, of course, for these examples, but if, say, you sampled another 3 and actually 2 or if not 3 more issues were discovered and actually 3 or 4 out of 6, that might constitute a major nonconformity in that case if, as I mentioned before, if there is significant doubt that there are effective controls in place. So I think it's not a number, but it's just good to keep that in mind when you sort of thinking of minors and majors, because one minor does not constitute a major, but many minors does in that case as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Perfect. So that's gone into nonconformity. So hopefully you should get an understanding of that. But what we're going to do now, actually, we'll go into correction and we're going to the contents of a nonconformity report. And you see on the right-hand side of the screen those 3 elements that sort of form together to make that nonconformity. And that's requirements, findings, and evidence. And we'll look at the left-hand side of the screen and actually see how these things are laid out. So the example here, Chris Small in this case has raised a particular nonconformity. You can see here the category is put as he's put as a minor nonconformity. But you look at the right-hand side, you see the standard reference, the ISO 14001 8.5.2. That's the requirement. So 0.1, if you will, out of 3 of those nonconformity triangle. And then if you look as well, you can see here underneath that it states not all waste held in stores is clearly identified. So going back to that audit checklist we mentioned before, that is the finding. The finding stating as well that actually what is supposed to happen isn't happening, and he's provided evidence to prove this up. And the example, the oil waste in area C and the chemical waste in area B. But you see how all those 3 sort of match together, and that forms specifically that nonconformity. But most importantly now, at this stage, the onus now jumps from the auditor to auditee, because they now have to do the correction and the corrective action process. Now, the correction is the action to eliminate the detected nonconformity. In this particular case, it will be addressing this particular example. So the not all waste held in stores is clearly identified, and making sure that the oil waste in area C is resolved and the chemical waste in area B is clearly identified. So that will be the correction. But more importantly is the corrective action. And this is defined as the action taken to eliminate the cause of a nonconformity and to prevent reoccurrence. Now, to be clear, the correction deals with the actual problem, and corrective action deals with the cause of the problem. And what you need to do as an organization is really delve into that sort of understanding what the cause of the problem is, so it can be eliminated, so that you can prevent problems from recurring in the future. Because ultimately, the correction deals with the symptoms, but the corrective action deals with the causes. And a good example of this as well is that, say you have a process where there is a manufacturing process, they're making a particular type of widget, and the widgets all have an 80% success rate, with 20% being not being meeting conformity. The correction in this particular case would be just assessing your process to identify whether these widgets need to be segregated for whatever reason, or amended for whatever reason so they fit conformity. But ultimately, in this particular case, you want to do the corrective action process. And by doing that root cause analysis, you realize that actually that the workers working on creating that widget do not understand the process of doing so. So you might need to consider them training to make sure they're removed in the past. So do the example there, retrain the workers, and you mistake-proof that process. So do you see the difference between that sort of corrective action process? But to put on that sort of internal auditor hat on, this is where the value comes in here, because what the internal auditor has identified is an opportunity. Right, this is the actual management system isn't working. Here the areas isn't working as detail. There's an opportunity now to address it, and more importantly, they will provide the corrective action required for the organization to address them. And it states here, in this particular case, in this example, it says that from the auditor, they need to identify all wastes required, as mentioned before, and then they need to review their waste labeling system to establish the reason for errors and amend as required. So the correction and the corrective action, which is in detail. And you can see from the next slide, from what the actual organization has done as a result of the internal auditors' sort of outcomes here, is that they've addressed this. You can see from that first line, the verification, the second line, apologies, it states barcode labeling now introduced and the procedure amended to reflect the new system. So they introduced a new bit of technology and they've updated the process to ensure that they are identifying the waste appropriately. And then second line there, it states operators have been given a toolbox talk on the need for and regulatory requirements related to waste and the importance of storing correctly and clearly identifying as such. So they've used training. They basically had a chat with their operators. They've emphasized the importance of doing this as well, and actually making sure they actually understand both the new process and why they need to do this. Most importantly, this is the key part here. They've introduced process, they've introduced a bit of technology, they've had a bit of training, they've actually done the process again, they've checked all the waste, they found it to be okay, and they've given 3 examples here of different batches for the auditor to go and check again. So you see what's happened here. The auditors found an issue, raised it, given an opportunity for the organization to rectify it. The organization has done so, improved their process immeasurably in this case, and has asked the auditor, come back, double check this for us, make sure we're doing this correctly. And in this particular case, you can see here, Chris Moore, this case as well, has signed it off 30th of September, and that whole process is now done. But hopefully it gives a bit of understanding in terms of how this goes. And I think we just got a question from I think Amelia, potentially, or Amela, apologies. To be clear, Amela, I believe in terms of whether that we were recording, this recording webinar will be recorded and recorded now, and the actual slides and the recording will be sent to you after the webinar. So there's a wonderful opportunity to hear my voice again, or if that sounds like someone's nightmare, then that's up to you. But you'll be able to hear this after this webinar. But just for everyone here, if you do have any questions, please feel free to use chat or the actual questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer them as we go through. Or we can wait till the end. It's entirely up to you. Perfect. So we're at 2:35 now, so a little bit sort of running slightly behind, but it's not the end of the world. But what we can do is that we'll now go into the actual value of internal audits, and you've been very patient with me as we go through that detail, especially now we understand what ISO management systems are and actually what the requirements are for internal auditing. But most importantly, if it hasn't been clear already, that an internal audit actually provides a wonderful means of doing a health check on your organization. And most importantly, if done correctly, and that's ensuring you're making sure you plan correctly, the actual audit is done to a certain standard, you're raising nonconformities, you're having conversations in that relationship with the auditees, and also you make sure that you're doing that corrective action process. They are an objective, evidence-based review of your organization's adherence to the relevant ISO standard and the organization's management system. It's a wonderful opportunity to make sure that everything is working as it should be and to the correct standard. Likewise, course, as well, obviously, some of you might need to call might be involved in the compliance. So, this ensures that when you do have this benefit of this internal audit, that you're complying both to the requirements of the organization, the standard, and other relevant regulations and contractual obligations I mentioned before. Because ultimately, if internal audit is not completed and the system is not performing, that might threaten the ISO standard certification, whatever that may be for your organization. That could be a significant risk for your organization's model and aims, particularly so. Say, for example, if you have an agreement with a supplier or another organization that requires that your own organization to have a particular standard, and if you miss those requirements, actually lose certification, that can have a huge impact upon losing new business or using existing business as well. And likewise as well, if you are failing, you've not had those internal audits, and regulatory requirements not being picked up, that could be significant in terms of not meeting those, whether it's a fine or sanctions or anything of that of the such, whatever it may be. Continual improvement. Now, this is particularly important for internal audits, and I think it's really key to emphasize this, especially for quite a few of the standards have that sort of 10.3 or clause 10.3, that continual improvement commitment. But ultimately, internal audits help organizations create a culture of continual improvement through reviewing processes, assessing nonconformance, and suggesting improvements to the performance of the management system. We will discuss this a little bit more when we discuss the value of internal auditors, but I think it's important to really emphasize here, internal audits are not meant to be a gotcha kind of exercise, not meant to expose things in a way. It's meant to be really meant to be an improvement exercise. From my own experience in both in conducting internal audits and also experiencing internal audits and also working with auditors, they don't go in an organization with the intent of trying to undermine systems. They want to improve it. They want the best for that system as well, and they're raising the nonconformities or opportunities for improvement as a way of going, right, this can be better. I know you can do better, and this is an opportunity to do that as well. And here's how you go about and do that. Perfect. As well. So we're going to go now into the actual change management. Now, to be clear, effective internal audits also provide organizations the opportunity to change, and this is an exercise in change management. And as individuals probably know from attending this call, change is difficult probably at the best of times, but organizations that embrace change and only bring benefits as well, because ultimately you're making a commitment to go, how can we do this better? How can we improve our processes? They make sure that we are doing the best from whether the systems or whether it's from against the standard as well. So ultimately, it really plays a part into that sort of that change management process. Perfect. So in terms of risk management, this is another element of internal audits which has a huge benefit. Internal audits ensure, right, that organizations are recording, assessing, and sufficiently mitigating risk within an organization. And forms quite a lot of that clause 6 element, quite a lot of standards. That's all of that risk assessment, risk treatment, depending on the standard you go in detail. And ultimately, having effective risk management is essential for the success of an organization's management system. Because it's not so much of just of understanding the severity and likelihood of particular risks, but ultimately, what is the organization doing about them? What kind of treatment plans have they done that? Have they mitigated them? Have they removed them? Have they not? But ultimately, these are questions that an auditor will ask. And if it's not done to a certain robust standard, this is a wonderful opportunity for the organization to go away, do a robust risk treatment plan or risk assessment plan, and then use the benefits of that, whether it's the risk or the opportunities, to then make the necessary changes to the organization. Perfect. If you continue as well, ISO requirements actually go into detail about this, about process versus individuals. And you might have this in your own organization where there might be a single point of failure, perhaps. There might be an individual who has access to one particular type of technology that might have gone out of date 20 years ago for whatever reason, but the organization is dependent on that one person and that technology as for a particular process or procedure. Now, ISO requirements really sort of try to iron that out and really has opportunity to identify that, whether it was a risk treatment, a risk assessment, or just as well, because it wants to replace spread that risk accordingly from, say, single points of failure to individuals as well, whether it's a whole process and whatnot. So it's important when you do those internal audits where actually this can flag areas where you may think, oh, actually there is a bit of a single point of failure. How can we sort of remove that bottleneck or remove that process that's inhibiting us in a certain way? And then finally, in terms of the benefits of internal audits, I think it's important to compare both internal and external audits in detail. Now, some of you may experience with internal and external, but an internal audit usually is conducted every sort of once a year. It may be more depending on the different standards, different requirements you may have, or risk level. But an external audit, usually done by NQA or another certification body, maybe 2 or 3 years, depending on that. But internal audits can be more beneficial that way because it'll be more regular, once a year in this case as well, and it allows you to go in more deeper into the organization's compliance to the standard and its own processes than maybe an external audit may do. And more importantly, those conducting the internal audit, and we'll discuss this in the next couple of slides later, actually have a better understanding perhaps of the organization than an external auditor would, because they understand the requirements, the external needs, internal or internal issues, whatever may be the case. So there's a wonderful opportunity there. So ultimately, internal audits help push your business forward by having those on a regular basis. Perfect. Right. We've got a couple questions come through. I'll just answer one of them because I'm just wary of time and I'll leave it to the end. So I think Mariappa, is please send the PowerPoint. The PowerPoints will be sent to after the webinar, as including the actual recording as well. So that will be sent to yourself. I think maybe a couple hours, a couple of days after the webinar commences. And Molly, do you have any recommendations for internal audited courses? I'll be remiss to say, as I am the training manager, and I apologize for saying this, that we do offer our courses, internal auditor courses, at NQA. So almost a very bashful, hopefully, sort of plug of our training. But ultimately, we do offer both internal and lead audit courses at NQA. So check them out when you have the chance, and I'll be speaking about them very briefly at the end of the presentation. Now, the last section of this slide, we look at the value of internal auditors. So we looked at auditing, now look at auditors. And to be clear, it's really important to have internal auditors, and as stated here in ISO 1911, which is the standard for auditing in general, looks at some of the actual the ideal personal attributes of an auditor. And you can see here in terms of you can understand what kind of traits are needed to actually really go down to the detail, really understand what is required, and actually really say, well, how can we improve this system? And you can see this here in terms of versatility, the perceptiveness, observant, decisive as well, self-reliant. All these elements are quite key in order to get the most out of those internal auditors. But most importantly, internal auditors can be considered the glue or gatekeepers perhaps of one organization, because they'll have a single vision of saying, right, we are compliant ISO 9001 or 14, and they will help sort of bring teams together to achieve that organization-wide adherence to the relevant standard. Ultimately, leadership is the key part of that, top management, as you know from the standard at clause 5, but they can be a really big part here in terms of making sure all the different elements are working together cohesively as one big team. And this shared vision will also make sure they meet the requirements of the standard, but also meet the requirements of any certification to the management system. Perfect. So if you keep going as well, as I sort of covered this very briefly for the in the previous section as well, the benefits of internal auditors, but ultimately, just very briefly again. Internal auditors will understand the organization to a far greater extent than any external auditor, because they know the individuals involved, they know the requirements, they know the actual things impacting the business on a detail. And this news understanding allows for more understanding of the inefficiencies and gaps for very business-specific processes. So when you make those improvements, you suggest those improvements from a position of strength, from a sort of knowing and understanding as well, and it provides a particular benefit for any organization, especially if they're committed to that continual improvement sort of process throughout the system and the organization. And yes, in collaboration with top management. Now, to be clear, those familiar with the standard or any ISO standard, that clause 5, that leadership or top management is essential to the entire process. You might remember that from that PDCA cycle. You can see that leadership sits right at the center, but internal auditors can play a really key part in working with top management to create a culture of continual improvement. Because ultimately, top management sets the culture, whether adherence to the standard, and ultimately, by setting that culture right, it's not so much a adversarial relationship. It's we're working here together because we want the best from the system, and by doing this and working together, we can turn those nonconformities into observations into things that have been resolved. So ultimately, that's having a big part in doing so. Finally, perfect. So we're moving on to the last parts of the slides, but I just wanted to give a bit of just a little point here about how you and your respective teams, organizations can get the most out of internal auditors and internal auditing. So if you want to bring value to an organization by having those internal auditors, there are a couple of things they can put in place that will just give them help not only themselves, those individuals, but also yourself and your organization. But most important one, that sort of top sort of left one, that former training with internal auditors, is really important that you have really trained auditors. I think we're going back to that question from, I believe it was from Molly. I think Molly Middleton saying it in terms of making sure you have training for that. It can be considered a non-conformity potentially if you have auditors who aren't actually trained. So it's really important that you have auditors who are trained, who have the experience, who are knowledgeable. And that goes to the next point, because ultimately, how many experienced, knowledgeable auditors, especially those who understand your business in particular, will make the process much more streamlined. And you can see this in terms of understanding the difference between non-conformity and an observation for opportunity for improvement, and also as well, just making just so they can actually go to communicate these things to the auditee in a way that's understandable to them. So those key points there, and if you create a culture and environment that allows that, that will help enormously. And then in that sort of that third one, that sort of bottom left one, supported by top management. I think it's important here, really important, that internal auditors in general need to be backed by leadership. You might see this firsthand, but it can be a common pitfall where internal auditors can get some pushback or resistance from individuals because they think the internal audit is almost a stain or an attack or something personal against the individuals or process. And it's anything but. Ultimately, they're there to improve the system, and it's not personal. It's there to say, right, how can we get the most out of the system? And here are the steps you can go about to do that. And having that support from top management rather than resistance can play a massive part in that as well. And then likewise as well, and this just go back to the last one as well, as we sort of discussed that, making sure that you collaborate with all employees in the organization, that sort of entire culture of continual improvement is apparent. And it can be that resistance element, but ultimately, just to reiterate this as well, making sure that that it's not personal. It's meant to be a exercise to support and guide and make sure that the managed system is as robust as it can be. Perfect. Right. I've got a couple questions in the chat, so we'll go for I'll go for the Q&A. But I just want to just go very briefly now, just to big up what I said before earlier in terms of the certification and training services that we offer at NQA. This is all the different standards and areas and sectors we offer training and certification for. So please take advantage and look at that. And likewise as well, if you have any further support for your needs, you can call us, email, visit us on socials as well, or join, I believe, our e-zine magazine at the In Touch and get out the latest updates for anything come through, whether it's different types of training, certification, legal updates as well, or whatever it may be. Perfect. Right. So we are now at the end of the presentation. So this is an opportunity for you to drop off if you've got better things to do. But I'm going to try and have a stab at different questions in the chat. So I'm just going to scroll down. There's quite a few chats as well. So just go for that. So I've got one from Dean. How best to address impartiality when smaller companies, the auditor has to audit an area that they work in or manage? This is a common thing that comes up as well, especially if organizations that have maybe less than 6 individuals, especially if you have to wear multiple hats as well. So in order to make sure you have the integrity, and that's a really key part, and you actually go back to the actual personal attributes as well. Ethical is that P part there, making sure you have the integrity. I would highly recommend that if possible, that you have another individual who audits your own work that maintains the integrity. Now that might mean more training, that might mean it may not have enough time, but that's the best way to go about it, because there will always be questions. Let's put it this way: there will always be questions raised if, say, a piece of work is being audited against the very person who wrote it, because then an external auditor or even other auditor might go, okay, well, how can you assure that this is actually correct when you're marking your own work? So unfortunately, Dean, I think you'd have to actually get someone else involved as well. If you're a one-man band, then that's a whole different issue. But that might be an opportunity for another person to do that as well. And it might even just be to audit your own work rather than to take on the whole roles and responsibilities of an internal auditor. But that's usually a way of addressing that issue. But if it makes you feel better, and Dean, it is an issue I've seen in the past several times. So I hope empathizing helps. So I've got one from Silvio. So apologies for pronouncing your name incorrectly. Would you please touch on minor NCAP versus major NCAP? A gray area might bring a little bit of subjectivity. NCAP. Do you mean nonconformity? I'm not familiar with that that acronym, but if you mean, do you mean nonconformity? Just to confirm. Yes. Okay, so we can go back to the actual slide on that, wherever it may be. So I'm just going to reiterate what I said before, but ultimately, just to be clear, a minor nonconformity is a nonconformity which does not affect the capability of the management system to achieve its intended result. So it's an issue, it's more than an actual opportunity for improvement, but ultimately, if you go back to that input, activity, output, that sort of process model, if you will, it does not impact the ability to have those outputs. It's an issue, clearly, but it's not impacting that as well. However, though, Silvio, to be clear, a major nonconformity is defined as should be classified as a major if significant doubt that effective process control is in place, or that products or services will meet their specific requirements. There's a particular part of the definition, and the second definition we'll go into in just a bit, but ultimately is making sure that actually if your input, activity, output is what you want to, what you intended to produce, that output actually being produced. And if it's not, in that case as well, or there's doubt that the controls in place, whether that is the calibration settings for a particular thing as well, or whether the warehousing is not meeting the requirements in terms of putting things in a particular area, so that actually it's not hard to get it's very hard to get particular resources. If there are doubts about that, then it may constitute a major nonconformity. But most importantly as well, linking to minor nonconformities, and this might be addressing your question in more detail, a major nonconformity can also be given if a number of minor nonconformities associated with the same requirement or issue demonstrate a systemic failure. So ultimately is where you've seen lots of minor nonconformities, and you go, right here, there's an issue, right? And it's more than just an individual issue. It's constituting as an impact upon the actual the process of the system. So yeah, I hope that gives a bit of more information there. I'm happy if you want to as well. If you're still unsure, I'm happy potentially we'd have a call off the webinar, or even you can send me an email and we can discuss it via there. I'm more than happy to have that conversation. Debbie, Silvia, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Debbie. Hi, Charles. Please advise if there is a standard template for audit report form. If not, there's a minimum checklist of what is required. So when you say audit report, do you mean the audit report produced at the end of the audit? Just to confirm, Debbie. Yes, perfect. Thank you for responding so quickly. The standard template. There is, I wouldn't say there is a standard template as a whole. Actually, can I show you an example? Actually, Debbie, what I can do potentially is if you provide your email address privately as well, I can send you an example. It's not on these slides here, but I can provide an example potentially if you want to just show it in terms of a template. I wouldn't say there's a sort of a template for all types of audit reporting, but ultimately when you're producing the report, you haven't got that much time to produce it because you're probably doing you have got a bit of time to produce at the end, but ultimately you want to be as succinct as possible and highlight both the benefits that actually, or the opportunities where actually they've done well and all the organizations have done well, but also cite the actual clauses and say actually there is a nonconformity there, because you want to make sure that actually you're being as concise and succinct as possible, and what they've done well, what they've done right, and then they're given an opportunity to go, right, this is how you go about do the corrective or the correction or the corrective action process. But Debbie, if you send me that stuff, I can send you an example when you have a chance. Okay, John, what advice do you have for repeat human error? Okay, John, just to indulge me a little bit, would you just expand upon that a bit more? Do you mean in terms of if someone keeps making the same mistake several times? Is that you're doing that? Auditing this type of a nonconformity? How to answer this? How to answer that as well? What advice do you have for repeat human error? So I think trying to have a good example of this. I think a good example that potentially would be to go back to that example mentioned before, where I would say an individual is making the same mistake. You have to do a corrective. You have to obviously address the correction and the corrective action process, and ultimately you make sure that individual, in this case, might have to receive the right training, the right understand why they're making those mistakes as well. So this is where, for example, where this delves perhaps not so much into the actual, if you will, the conformity to the manager system. It's more into line management, where you might have to have a conversation with an individual to understand why they are actually making those mistakes as well. So if there are repeat human errors, that's maybe more of a situation you might deal with as an organization rather than here is the manager system. But ultimately, in the manager system, John, you have to make sure that they are conforming to the actual process as well. And there are multiple tools you can use that, whether it's communication, training, awareness, what such, and whether controls. But that might delve more into organization. So apologies, John, that if I answered your question. So thank you very much, everyone involved. I apologize if we've gone a little bit over time, but more than 40, 45 minutes I mentioned at the very beginning of the day. But hopefully I answered the questions. I hope I gave everyone a nice time to about internal auditing. And yeah, and have a lovely rest of the day, have a rest of the week, and I hopefully will speak to you all very soon. Take care.